El Internet debe estar gobernado con principios democráticos en sociedades democráticas.
I don't know if I, in 2009, would have been smart enough to write such principles.
It's not just sufficient to have a list of principles written down, but it's important that a large number of people understand and agree with and subscribe to these principles.
Not everyone may immediately agree with all of the principles, but there can be a discussion around each of them.
Me gustaría mucho ver que iniciativas como esas se replican en otros países de la región.
You know, I think the principle that's widely adopted, that all the rights and freedoms and responsibilities that are enjoyed by citizens offline should be enjoyed by citizens online, is a absolutely correct principle, assuming you have a human rights framework offline and that's being ensured online, which again is an assumption that is not correct in many jurisdictions.
La regulación más común que tenemos en el mundo son los derechos humanos.
Sí.
Y la forma de garantizar de que todos vamos a poder usar el Internet igual es tener un enfoque de derechos humanos y de libertad de expresión en el manejo del Internet, porque facilitan otros derechos.
Claro.
Y la libertad de expresión, en este caso, facilita la investigación científica, facilita la educación, facilita el periodismo, facilita la información ciudadana, la toma de decisiones. Y el Internet hoy es el instrumento más importante para la libertad de expresión y el acceso a la información. Entonces tiene una función totalmente distinta. Esto, si se lo dejamos a los gobiernos, va a ser el control de la ciudadanía.
Sí.
Entonces ahí hay una contradicción que no nos hemos puesto de acuerdo, digamos, en el tema de seguridad. ¿Hasta dónde que están dispuestos a ceder a la privacidad para tener más seguridad?
There's organizations such as in the U.S., the NSA, which is trying to do the most it can to find ways to tap into that or to use cyber warfare and things like that. So on the one hand, it offers enormous amounts of freedom. On the other hand, it's another opportunity for governments to try to make their own use of it for their own purposes.
With companies like Google and Facebook. It's an amazing idea to bring the government, to bring private industry, to bring academics and civil society all together at the same table. And it's really how dialogue has to happen.
There are few things that are actually as important as multi-stakeholder engagement. And the reason for this is that CSIRTs operate in a very, very technical area. And we have a great community with a lot of technical experts that really understand what they're doing there. But the reality is that the internet today is being used by so many different types of people with so many different types of technical background that they don't necessarily understand all of the activities of a CSIRT.
Everybody's got skin in the game. If it doesn't work, everybody who is each of those categories of groups is hurt. From my point of view, as soon as you put things together where you've got all the materially concerned parties represented, and nobody represented who is not a materially concerned party, then you've got it right.
Creo que es una de las características más positivas de la gobernanza de Internet, es que nunca estamos conformes con el modelo que tenemos y seguimos buscándole dónde están los defectos con el propósito de mejorarlos.
And in many cases, there will be technical solutions that are far easier and far more efficient and far more effective than coming at it from a law enforcement point of view. So it's important to bring together the just exactly along the lines that you were talking about, people from different backgrounds, even to work on the same problem.
It is important that we have not only compliance with content accessibility guidelines for web content, but many other parts of the internet, including the devices used by end users, need to be accessible.
Hay grandes desafíos de acceso, que yo he insistido mucho, especialmente en el mundo en vías de desarrollo.
Las brechas no son solamente entre países desarrollados y países no desarrollados, son entre países de nuestra región también, internamente, y también brechas que tenemos dentro de los propios países. En lugares rurales, de geografía compleja, las condiciones son totalmente distintas.
Vamos ver o que melhorou. A gente tem muito mais gente se comunicando, interessada em acessibilidade e se comunicando. Agora, com tudo isso, é como se a gente tivesse as ferramentas, mas essas ferramentas a gente não está usando, de fato. Essas ferramentas não estão sendo efetivas, porque a gente continua não conseguindo acessar informação em muitos sites, eu diria assim, né? A maioria a gente tem barreiras de acessibilidade. O que está faltando para acessibilidade, no meu entender, é a universalidade.
So it is very important for us to fix accessibility for the disabled and the aged persons in our population.
Sobre o tema da diversidade na relação com a internet.
A diversidade a gente sempre enxerga como um aspecto positivo, e acho que a gente deve ter esse aspecto como um aspecto principal. Mas é verdade que a diversidade também, se ela não é trabalhada junto com a dinâmica de liberdade e de respeito, ela implica conflito.
Acho que a internet, ela ajudou a gente a compreender talvez a dimensão da falta da diversidade. Porque não foi a internet que, por exemplo, criou o racismo. O racismo existe numa sociedade. O que acontece é que a internet fez com que esta dimensão da sociedade, por exemplo, como a brasileira, ficasse mais escancarado.
O Brasil é uma sociedade que constrói-se em harmonia e em conflito. Então, a base hoje, por exemplo, que a gente tem de uma sociedade em que o machismo é muito presente, o racismo é muito presente.
Especialmente essa área de redes, é uma área de resolver problemas. E a gente tem que não ter medo de sair rastejando por baixo de um rack para procurar onde é que está o fio desconectado. Não é uma área que tipicamente as mulheres se envolvem. Essas coisas a gente tem que mudar.
Então a diversidade hoje, dentro dessa discussão do Fórum da Internet no Brasil, é algo de extrema importância para que a gente possa entender que nós, comunidade tradicional, também temos o acesso e temos condições de desenvolver um trabalho junto com a sociedade civil urbana referente às comunicações e à tecnologia.
Innovations cause risks. What are you going to do about those risks? Well, if you over-control it, you don't get an innovation. And if you under-control it, you get a lot of bad guys figuring out how to take advantage of the new attack opportunities.
Brazil hopes very much to be the hub of invention in the Americas and around the world. And I think it's important to make sure that Brazil is supporting its innovators. So I think the legal environment is crucial for an investment decision. You aren't, as a venture capitalist, going to put millions of dollars into a company that could be declared illegal the next day. Okay? That investment would suddenly, that $50 million investment may be worth $0 with one quick ruling.
The reality is that historically, lots of people have not been in favor of innovation. They get scared. When a U.S. congressman asks me, if we have more open communication and more people are able to use it to communicate with each other, will that cause a law enforcement problem? Probably.
And so we need to allow the architecture of the internet to evolve while at the same time maintaining the features that made it such a great platform for innovation and economic growth.
Así nosotros separamos y regulamos lo que es Internet. Regulamos a las empresas que proveen el acceso a Internet, pero no regulamos el contenido de Internet. Es decir, las aplicaciones over the top no son reguladas. Sin embargo, sí se establece el principio de neutralidad, que está desde el año 2010, donde obliga que las empresas no pueden establecer restricciones, no pueden establecer limitaciones, bloqueos, y por tanto en Chile está garantizado de que cualquier persona puede desarrollar aplicaciones sobre Internet abiertamente sin problema. Entonces, por ejemplo, si hay una entidad que quiere una radio por Internet, no tiene que pedirle permiso a nadie y transmite por Internet.
You need to make sure that you don't create an environment that gives certain players an advantage in the regulatory process over others. The network needs to be application agnostic. That means it cannot discriminate among applications or classes of applications. That's very important because it prevents internet service providers from distorting competition or increasing costs through access fees. So again, if you look at case-by-case proceedings, if you're a startup and you have 0 or 1 lawyers on staff, you are not capable of running multi-year proceedings in front of the regulatory agency. By contrast, if you're a large company, you have lots of lawyers, you have lots of money, you can afford to play games at the agency. So we need to think about that as well.
Oh, we don't talk about net neutrality. We haven't talked about that for at least 5 years.
So the exceptions, I've talked about zero rating, and I've said that in my view, zero rating, if it's short-term and non-exclusive, would be an exception that would be acceptable in particular countries, in particular circumstances. And this is the interesting use of language, right? If we call them exceptions, maybe we can live with them. If we call them violations, because the net neutrality principle must never be infringed, then we just can't have a conversation that everyone can agree on.
We should govern the uses or the misuses of the internet, not the internet itself. So, of course, that particular principle in the Decalogue resonates very strongly with me.
The Manila Principles document contains two kinds of directives. One aimed at governments and states when they are formulating their laws and regulations around the issue of intermediary liability. Mm-hmm. But they also look at corporations and their policies and practices for content removal.
We should look to the offline world for analogies before determining whether or not we need something new in the online world. And I think that holds here as well.
And it tries to evolve a set of principles that can be used by both states and by corporations when they want to ensure that a proper balance exists between freedom of speech concerns and between the need to be able to react to valid requests for removal of content.
You know, the fact that we look at those people that are responsible for the content and attempt to hold them responsible for their actions as opposed to the internet itself or the intermediaries in this case is entirely appropriate. So I think we need to be careful about trying to make those intermediaries the judge, if you will, because I think that will move us very, very quickly to basically a censorship by proxy position.
This is a system that has to be looked at as a large-scale social science activity, not just as a purely technical activity. Even the behavior, here's a good example. How do you build a system that is going to be resilient? And then you get forces like a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack, in which tons of traffic, lots and lots of traffic is focused on one site, and it causes a jam, and then that site goes down. Now that may be because somebody is deliberately trying to do it, or it could be for unintended reasons. Victoria's Secret unveiled its new line of lingerie over the network, and they got more traffic than they could handle, and all of a sudden it brought their portion of the network down. So you have to look at these things from a different perspective.
What did we do so far? I think we all, the cybersecurity players, stakeholders, we all have a huge responsibility to avoid the internet or cyberspace to become a battlefield. Internet is not developed to be the battlefield. It is developed to make the world a better place for everyone, for economic growth and social prosperity. And every stakeholders have a responsibility to keep the internet that way. And to do that, we must care and pay more attention to the cyber ecosystem health and improving the health, and we must keep working together for that.
The board sat together and we thought through the problem of making sure that the CERT community can work together well. And we kind of thought of collaboration as something that is really rooted in 3 different principles. First of all, we need to be able to build a community where the teams can communicate and work together. Second, the teams need to be able to rely on each other, so they need to be able to know what the capability of other teams is. For instance, when one team reaches out to another team and they have a security incident that's ongoing, they need to know exactly what they can expect from that other team, as in what is going to be a positive collaboration around this incident. And finally, they need to have the tools and techniques, or standards if you wish, to be able to exchange information rapidly, so that they can actually have their people focus on doing the difficult work, the work that really requires people to think through problems, whereas they can use those tools, techniques and standards to exchange data very, very, very quickly on a machine-to-machine level.
There have actually been quite a few changes in the basic protocols over time.
Yes.
They have been incremental and they have been compatible.
Yes.
So you have TCP fast start, you have content delivery networks that are caching things, you have any number of very sophisticated changes that have taken place, but they have not positioned themselves as this is an incompatible, new, distinct network that you have to throw the whole thing out. But nonetheless, the changes are big. They're not just small, little, tiny changes. They're very ones that have made substantial difference in the operation of the network. With the protocols that were running 30 years ago, if you limit ourselves to those protocols today, the network would not be working very well.
Nós temos uma situação em que os principais intervenientes num processo de padronização são empresas diretamente interessadas, porque vão vender produtos naquela área, e provedores de serviço. O governo até tem um papel um pouco menor. E essas pessoas estão defendendo interesses corporativos. E padrões são essenciais para a interoperabilidade. Por quê? A interoperabilidade é que vai respaldar o usuário, ao fim e ao cabo, de se tornar vítima, né? Cativo dos desígnios de uma grande corporação que, de repente, para aumentar seus lucros, diz: ok, essa versão do sistema de agora em diante está descontinuada e vocês têm que comprar essa outra. Nós temos um usuário bastante despreparado para essas estratégias. Então, alguém tem que pensar nesse usuário, que é a maioria da população, e que no Brasil é um usuário entusiasta.
Well, the great thing about the network is that the amount of stuff that is forced on you is very, very little. You can send an individual packet that does not an IP. Well, it has to be an IP packet. It doesn't have to be a TCP packet. It could be a UDP packet, or it could be something else. And it's only a question of whether or not the other guy understands it. But the genius of the IP design is that it is intended to have almost nothing in it. It's intended to be as little as possible rather than as much as possible.
Governments cannot, on the one hand, want to enable the use of ICTs for economic growth and development, seek to encourage innovation, and then on the other hand put a brake on these activities. I think one either has to say we are moving into an information economy, into a knowledge economy. We are going to support initiatives, accepting that this is a global economy that we're in, the internet economy is a global economy. We need to look at how we can enable local innovation, encourage local startups and apps and whatever in order to compete in this global environment, but accept that it is a global environment. So like a lot of protectionism, I think it's problematic. If somebody is, through the innovative and disruptive introduction of technology, having an impact on a local service provider, or that is actually probably high priced or overpriced, that's why people aren't using the service, or providing a real alternative for people at a lower cost. I think local responses have to be more innovative and more competitive, and say, oh, actually, if that's what's going to happen, we're also going to introduce technology, because it's very basic technology that is going to be able to compete with this, and so we'll have, our own local version of Uber, or something, whether it's Airbnb or whatever it is. These are, very innovative, effective ways of sharing resources in especially in our case, in stressed economies that also, generate revenues and things. So there are the issues around how do you tax these services, and very legitimate concerns that we have to work through and consider. But I think a ban on them is really retrogressive, and I think it's very contradictory for countries that have put, internet economy or digital economy as one of their main pillars in their economy.
I get the chills every time we talk about internet governance, because the internet needs administration. It probably does not need governance, other than ways of figuring out who's accountable for misdeeds. And what to do about it is an ordinary societal problem. Thieves on the streets are a problem. Bad people on the internet are a problem. We don't view that as something to build governance structures around. We view it as something that governance structures ought to figure out a way to deal with. And certainly by ending up with a global network, we've ended up with global problems and global issues which can't be solved in a single country. And there are people debating the governance and making the decisions who do not understand the internet, do not understand the administrative side, do not understand the separation, do not understand the protocols.
When we started with the drafting of the Italian declaration, we had a seminar in the Chamber of Deputies, where the author of the Marco Civil were there giving to people the information about the importance of the Marco Civil. The Marco Civil has been everywhere in Europe taken into account, seriously taken into account.
Hay muchas formas de buscar soluciones a los problemas. La regulación es una de ellas. El debate público es otra forma de buscar soluciones. Creo que no hay que renunciar a la posibilidad de regular actividades, pero regular también crea restricciones, ¿no? Y por lo tanto hay que apelar a la regulación solo cuando ese es el camino correcto.
A taxa de uso semanal do brasileiro praticamente uma das mais elevadas do mundo. O comitê gestor tem que lutar por soluções que assegurem para a população o uso apropriado da internet.
So I think having the principles actually makes a lot of sense because it engenders a discussion, and you can get to a certain agreement where you actually know how people stand with respect to the principles.
And it's important to articulate, explain, and educate people about these principles.
Iniciativas como el Marco Civil en Brasil creo que son muy importantes y ayudan mucho. Ofrecen un marco, ¿no? Un framework para el trabajo. Eso no quiere decir que sea una garantía, pero al menos nos da una aproximación más general de cuál es el consenso a un consenso que hemos arribado a nivel de la sociedad. Es decir, bueno, esto es más o menos, describe la forma en que queremos que sea Internet.
You guys have done an amazing job and really built a solid framework for Brazil. It's a leading example anywhere in the world.